Cool, hi, I'm Ian. As Tyler said, I'll be talking about commercialization of space, what that means for us today, and how exactly we got in that position. So, let's start off at the beginning. NASA started 60 years ago, they just had their anniversary. And at the time, and for quite a few decades after that, only world governments were in the game of space. We had NASA, later on the European Space Agency, Chinese Space Agency, only governments. So how do we get from just governments controlling space to now quite a few different companies you might realize, or recognize some of the names up here? It all kind of started, or prompted rather, in 1982 when a private company decided to buy a refurbished missile from the United States government, and they launched a satellite in it. This is notable because it was the very first private company that decided to launch something into space. No, they did not develop the rocket, but they weren't the government, so it was a pretty big deal. A few short years after that, 1984, at this time, the moon races were over. It was 10 years in the past. NASA's budget was still higher than today, but it was declining, and the public interest in space was also declining. So the president at the time, Ronald Reagan, decided he would sign a Space Act into law to reinvigorate the public's interest, but also shift some of the monetary stuff off of NASA's shoulders. And this act allowed for private companies both to develop their own rockets and also their own satellites. So they didn't have to buy refurbished anymore. They could go out and do whatever they wanted. So 1990 was the first time people really took advantage of this law. Orbital, who is today, well, was actually known as Orbital ATK, they changed the name again earlier this year. They made their first privately developed rocket. Here's what it looks like. You've noticed that it's actually launched off of a plane, not typical of rockets that we see today. But interesting enough, this design is still being used today. They're still flying it today. And it's been pretty successful. They've done quite a few launches. Also interesting about this rocket is it's 3, possibly 4 stages, depending on what configuration you want it in. And the first 3 stages are solid rocket fuel, not liquid rocket fuel. So, kind of cool. To describe what a rocket is, for those of you that aren't familiar with the term stages and whatnot, I used a Lego model because it's easier to show and the pictures were easier to find. A stage is essentially just little parts of the rocket that break up, and they each have their own engines. And the reason this is the way it is, rockets are very heavy, and they have to get into space, and that takes a lot of fuel. So if you can have a fuel tank with its own engines here, and then once you get up closer into space, you drop it off, it's less heavy, it takes less fuel to push it further. So all rockets at this point are in stages because it's the only thing that makes sense. So going a little bit further, closer now, 2004, George Bush put a little bit more oomph into the Space Act, created a new amendment allowing companies to not just send cargo into space, but to send humans into space for the first time. Not just to the International Space Station, but to wherever they wanted. And notably, he also told the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, that they had oversight over any matters into space, and more specifically, matters regarding people going into space per this act. But they weren't able to give any safety regulations until about 2012, which is the arbitrary deadline they set. They wanted to, before this point, allow companies to develop their own systems to learn through their own experiences. But notably, we haven't sent people into space yet. So this deadline was actually pushed back quite a few times. Now it sits at 2023. So we'll see if it gets pushed back again. Why is this important that we send people into space? It's more important than it was even in 2004 because we don't have any other ways to send people into space other than this rocket right here, which is the Russian Soyuz rocket. This is the primary vehicle that we use to send people into the ISS now, ISS being the International Space Station. And that's it right here for those of you that aren't familiar. So obviously a good idea not to be solely dependent on one rocket in another country, which is why they want people to start building their own rockets to diversify, and have it in America, it'd probably be cheaper that way too. So moving up a little bit more, the last sort of oomph that was put into the Space Act was by President Obama, when he said, not only can you send cargo and people into space, but now you can mine space. If you find it and you can get there, it's yours, you can do whatever you want with it. Nothing has been done with this yet, but there's quite a few companies that are developing techniques to find asteroids that have good mineable materials, and also developing these systems to land and capture said asteroids, possibly even bring them to Earth orbit to make it easier to mine. We'll see what comes of that. So now I'm going to start talking about some of the current companies that are employing these new technologies, new rockets, new ways to get into space. And I know everybody has their favorites. I'm sticking with just domestic companies, and I had to pick a few. So I'm sorry if some cool ones weren't covered. It's just way too much to go over. But I want to start off with Blue Origin, which is one that most of you probably have heard of. It was started in 2000 by a guy you're probably familiar with, Jeff Bezos, who owns and operates Amazon. And he actually got the idea, well, he was interested in space all throughout high school, but in the year 2000, he watched October Sky for the first time and said, this is a really cool movie, these kids building these rockets. I want to build my own rockets, so he did. Did a little bit later afterwards. In 2003 was the first time the public was actually made aware that this company existed at all. It was kept secret, and then they started buying land, and everybody thought it was for Amazon. So it was this weird mystery thing, and then he finally said, nah, I'm just going to build rockets on this land. So it was 2 years later, in 2005, when he actually showed off plans for the first rocket. I don't know if any of you have seen this before. It's called the New Shepard. And you'll notice it's actually pretty small for a rocket. It's just the first stage, and then this little capsule here on the top. And the main purpose of that capsule going into the future is to bring people into space. It's more of a space tourism thing than it is satellites or cargo or anything like that. So you can see here in this slide, just focus on this part, we'll get to this later, but this is the New Shepard flight plan. It lifts off, goes just above the Kármán line, which sits about 100 kilometers, I'm sorry. And it's the generally agreed upon line of space. So it's just in the space, it hovers there for a minute or two, you can take some pictures, and then it goes down and it lands the first stage, just a little short ways away. Notable about this, not only the fact that it lands the first stage and the fact that they've done this before, granted not with people, they did it before SpaceX did it. Not a lot of people know that. So I'll get into why people don't know that later when I get into SpaceX. But just know that they did. It's a pretty cool rocket. But it's not the only thing that they do. They also build their own engines and supply them to ULA, the United Launch Alliance. I'll get more into what they do later. In addition to also having NASA contracts to bring supplies to the International Space Station. They've been developing this new rocket called the New Glenn. It's just in development now. They haven't built anything, they haven't tested anything. This is what it looks like. And it's a pretty big rocket, to give you some scale. This is the New Shepard, the one I showed you before, and this is the New Glenn. So it's more of a launch provider in the sense that they're going to do satellites and such, but they want to get out of just low Earth orbit with this rocket. This is really the one that they're hedging their bets on. And going back to the New Shepard for a moment, I should mention that they're going to start selling tickets probably this year for about $200,000 to $300,000 if you want to go into space. Now's your chance. But outside of these avenues, selling tickets and getting some contracts, they get most of their funding directly through Jeff Bezos. He actually liquidates about $1 billion in Amazon stock every year, pours it directly into Blue Origin. So he's got the money, but good for him. They're doing some pretty cool stuff. Moving on, SpaceX, probably the one that most of you are the most aware of, and the one that's, in my opinion, done the coolest and the most things. was started by Elon Musk in 2000, another billionaire. You can see the trend here. He didn't have the same type of origin story, but along the same lines, he wanted to, he's always loved space, he wanted to reinvigorate the public with the idea of space, and he wanted to do that by sending a greenhouse to Mars. Maybe a little bit idealistic, I don't know if he could do that, but he wanted to do it by buying Russian ICBM rockets, and then sending it off that way. So he went to Russia a few times to ask about procuring these rockets, and they quite literally laughed him in the face and said billionaires shouldn't play with toys like that. And the lead designer of the ICBM spat on his shoes. So a little discouraging. He didn't take it badly though. He decided, okay, well I'm going to do a 360 and I'm going to build my own rockets and learn how to do it by myself. So he did exactly that. And in 2009, he launched the Falcon 1. It just has one engine, and then the first stage, and then a tiny little second stage, and the payload. They only had enough money for, they only had enough money for about 3 launches. The first 2 exploded, one on the pad, one after it went up. But the third one was successful, and NASA was really impressed by this. So they gave SpaceX $1.6 billion to develop a system, or just use the Falcon 1, however they wanted, to get stuff to the International Space Station. So in 2009, like I said, they were the very first, well that was when the Falcon 1 was successful, and that was the very first time that a company developed its own rocket and sent something into space, a satellite. So shortly after that, once they got the funding from NASA, they decided we're ditching the whole Falcon 1 thing, and they moved up to the Falcon 9, and full steam ahead on that, launched that, it was successful. 2012, they made good on their agreement with NASA, and they started delivering stuff to the International Space Station, which is something that they still do today, recovery as well, not just delivery. 2013, they started the Grasshopper program. So to explain this a little bit, it's that first stage I mentioned is the one that they cast off first. It's usually the biggest stage. So it's a major part of the rocket, and if you can get that part back, then you can save a lot of money, because then you have the ability to possibly reuse it. So the Grasshopper program was when they took the first stage of their Falcon 9 rocket, and they flew it up a little bit, and flew it down and tried to land it. It exploded a lot of times before they were able to finally land it. But then once they were able to land it, they started flying it higher and higher until it went almost like 2 or 3 miles in the air. And then after that, they said, okay, we think we know enough, we're gonna try to land it ourselves with a real rocket. So they started this program in 2013. And you can see, I'll show you why the SpaceX landing is the one that everybody usually knows about. So compared to the New Shepard, it goes about twice as high at 200 kilometers, twice as high as the Kármán line. And in addition, because it's an orbital rocket, it goes a lot more horizontal. So it has to scrub off that horizontal velocity. This is how the rocket keeps going afterwards. But the first stage turns back, and then has to land itself from that much higher, that much faster, much harder. So when they did it, that's why people usually pay attention to that. It's considered the real first landing because it actually went into space and whatnot. Anyway, 2014, the following year, NASA awarded them $2.6 billion to send people to the International Space Station, trying to take advantage of the law that was signed in 2005 that I mentioned before. Next year, Falcon 9 did its first landing. This was on land. And the year after that, it did its first landing on water. So the difference here is also important. If you land on land, you have to slow yourself down a lot more and make sure you get back to one specific spot. But if you land on water, you don't have to slow down as much, and you can kind of move a ship wherever you want to. That's the whole point of water. So if you can save on fuel, you can launch things higher into space because you can use more fuel. And it's much easier to catch. You have a lot more flexibility. So the fact that they do drone ship landings is pretty significant. 2017 was the first time that they reused one of the rockets that they landed. And as I said, the first stage is a pretty significant portion. So being able to reuse just this one stage per launch saves about 75% of their entire launch cost, which comes out to about $21 million. So decent savings. And then in 2018, last year, was when they launched their Falcon Heavy. And instead of trying to explain this, I want to show you a video of that launch and of that landing, and then I'll try to commentate as we go along, but it's pretty cool. So, this is the Falcon Heavy. You'll note that on the sides, it's actually just two Falcon 9s basically taped to it. So another pretty cost-effective method of having a big rocket. But because there's essentially three Falcon 9s, there's one in the middle as well retrofitted, you can launch higher mass stuff. So here's the stages coming off of the main middle booster, and these are each cameras on the stages as they descend down back to Earth. So you can see here's itself lighting the engine, trying to slow itself down, and the two stages with the pads in sight, that's these pads. And as they come down, you'll see the two stages right next to each other, landing almost simultaneously. So, pretty cool, but that's not even all of it. This is Elon Musk's personal Tesla Roadster that he used to drive all the time. When you send up a rocket, you have a dummy payload to simulate high mass being in the rocket. So instead of sending up a block of concrete or water, which is what people usually do, he sends up his car with a dummy in it, wearing the official SpaceX spacesuit that was designed for the astronauts they're going to send to the ISS. So pretty cool. And there's other little Easter eggs in there, but I'll let you find out for yourself or if you have questions later. And they had a live stream of this going for like 16 hours. It's pretty cool. You can, if you want to look that up later too, I highly recommend it. Anyway, so the Falcon Heavy was what they planned to use to send people to Mars. And this is what the inside of the Dragon capsule, which is their cockpit, looks like. You'll notice it's very big and spacious compared to what older cockpits look like with all the complicated buttons and such. And they have just screens and a few buttons. It's supposed to be really comfortable, really pretty, obviously. They decided very shortly after this that they didn't want to use this to send people to Mars. They were developing something new called the BFR, the Big Falcon Rocket. You'll notice it is pretty big. So here's it right next to the Falcon Heavy, and also the amount of mass that it can take is at a staggering 150 tons. So either you can bring a lot of stuff into space, or you can bring people to Mars. Either way, pretty significant rocket. And it actually, with its Grasshopper unit, so I mentioned the Grasshopper test, it's going to go through its same test because they want to try to reuse such a big rocket. It's going to start very soon, and they just finished the test unit. Here's a little dummy with a SpaceX suit to scale. And this is an actual picture, not a rendering. It's going to be shiny and such too. So it's maiden flight right now is scheduled to be in 2023. And it's pretty cool, not only because they're going to be taking it around the moon, which we don't really send people to the moon anymore, but this guy, Yasuka Maezawa, is another billionaire who decided he wanted to buy out tickets for the entire rocket. They had 100 seats. He said, I want all of them. And he wasn't going to fill all 100 seats, and it wasn't just going to be him. It's even cooler, because he decided he was going to send 6 to 8 artists from around the world for free around the moon with him. And then a year or two following the moon mission, they were going to have an exhibit showcasing all the art from the inspiration from the moon. So pretty cool, pretty philanthropic. Keep your eyes out for that. And they plan to fund the majority of this BFR mission to go to Mars and such with Starlink, which is their aim to have a global internet, basically global satellite internet. They want to launch 4,500 satellites up into space, which might not sound like a huge number when you talk space numbers, usually very big, but currently there's only about 1,800 satellites in space, so they want to more than double all of the satellites in space right now. And they have permission to do this, and they've launched a few test satellites already. So it's going to be pretty big, and they're going to get a lot of money from it. Moving on a little bit, though, to my last company that I want to talk about, ULA, United Launch Alliance, formed in 2005. And as their name suggests, they are an alliance between two other companies, Boeing and Lockheed Martin, two companies that have been around in space for quite a long time, working very closely with NASA and the US government. They quite literally just got together and use the same rockets that they already had. So, namely the Delta IV and the Atlas V are the two rockets that they use the most. And they actually had a little bit of a legal run-in with SpaceX shortly after their inception. SpaceX said that they were having essentially a monopoly on all of the contracts. And if you look, this was pretty much the case. Even though ULA's launches were 2, 3 times, sometimes 4 times the price of SpaceX, all the contracts were at ULA. So they brought it up with the FAA, who I mentioned is now in charge of all the space stuff, and they sided with SpaceX, put in some antitrust laws, and that caused ULA to downsize, which could have actually been a very good thing, because after this they decided, hey, we can't build our business off of just sending rockets for the government. We need to send rockets carrying payloads for any private company that wants to purchase through us. So they also decided we need to sort of expand what we have to offer, and they created the Delta IV Heavy, which is basically the Delta IV, like the Falcon Heavy, just has its first stages kind of taped to the side of it. Not really taped, but more cost-effective and can take heavier stuff into space. And they're currently developing a rocket called the Vulcan. It's still in development, so I can't really tell you much about it other than it's supposed to be really big and very powerful. So look forward to that. And they were also awarded a multi-billion-dollar contract with NASA to send people into space. This is actually the team that they already selected, and this is the Starliner, which is where they're going to be on top of their Atlas V rocket. Here's to scale, so it's going to be about that big. And they hope to do an unmanned test flight sometime later this year. I forgot to mention, but SpaceX is also doing an unmanned test flight tomorrow. So if anybody wants to watch that, they have a live stream, you can check it out. The point I'm getting, though, with all these companies is not to just keep going into specifics, but more look at the bigger picture. With these laws in place that allow you to mine asteroids, send people into space, and with these companies that are building rockets that actually have the capability to do these things and to innovate, to land them, to reuse, the things that you can think of are pretty much endless. And the things that they're planning to do not only are very cool, but they're going to happen very soon. So like the colonization of Mars, Elon Musk plans to do that in the 2030s and send people back into space in the 2020s. So this stuff is really right there at the door. And I hope learning more about the stuff that they're currently doing to employ these new technologies to reach these goals is something that it gets me really excited, but I hope it gets you really excited too. But before I end the talk, I mentioned that a lot of these rockets tend to fail a lot. So SpaceX, back when they were all the way doing their grasshopper test, decided to start a blooper reel of all the times that they messed up and their rockets didn't quite land. So as a send-off, I wanted to play the blooper reel so you can see sort of what goes into testing these rockets and creating these new technologies.
Yes. So, okay, so we went from Falcon 1 to Falcon 9. Tell me, what's going on with Falcons 2 through 8?
Yeah, so they're rocket scientists. I promise they're not totally dumb. As I mentioned before, the Falcon 1 only has one engine, and the Falcon 9, you might guess, has 9 engines. So that's sort of how they skipped the numbers, just dependent on the power of the rocket. Yes?
Now that China has landed a lander where no one has landed one before on the dark side of the moon, do you anticipate that this is the beginning of another space race?
Okay, so the question was, now that China has landed a lander on the opposite side of the moon, which is something that nobody's done before, do I anticipate a new form of the space race? I do, but probably not in the way that you're getting at. I think there will be an initial race back to the moon, just because that's the most prolific thing we all have in our minds when we think of going into deep space. But I think this new space race will really focus more on going to a place like Mars or colonization, just the more bigger pictures. I think that's really just more of the beginning stepping stone of what's to come. Okay, so the question is, are there other companies that are getting into this space race that are sort of up and coming? I only highlighted 3 companies, but there are dozens of companies that are creating their own rockets, developing their own satellites, doing private launches, and then even trying to get into space tourism. So mainly a company like Virgin Galactic. They don't really do payload launches, so I didn't really focus on them, but they have sort of like a space plane that kind of fly into space, and actually I think they recently did go above the Kármán line, so technically it was the first American citizen to launch from American soil to get into space. But yeah, there are other companies that are doing this, and I could have gone on and on about all the companies. Yeah, so the question is, so there's a company called Rocket Lab, another one of the many space companies that are getting into this business of building rockets, developing their own launch, providing services. They have small rockets, and the question was, how do I see that playing out when all of these companies building really big rockets? I think they are very, very necessary and will probably do very well, because not everything is huge payloads, especially as we get into like CubeSats, which are just little cube satellites, small things like that. Even if you just don't have a huge payload, a lot of these launches actually have multiple payloads, and they're smaller payloads, but they just clump them together because it's more cost effective. But there's still a huge market and an ever-growing market for launching a lot of these small satellites, and I think they're very necessary, and they're going to do very